Okay, so now that we've talked about producing gametes, I just want to talk a little bit about reproduction. I'm going to focus on animal reproduction, particularly human reproduction, but this kind of has a broad application to reproduction in a lot of different organisms. And when we go through these specific organisms, we're going to learn about their various methods of reproduction, but we're going to focus on animal reproduction right now. So, let's make a baby. I'm sure you're familiar with the basic anatomy of the reproductive systems. So we have ovaries, and then we have these fallopian tubes, sometimes called uterine tubes. And I'm a terrible artist, so just kind of bear with me here. And then we have the uterus, and then we've got the opening to the uterus, which is the cervix. And then this is the vaginal canal. Okay, so through the process of meiosis, our eggs are produced. Now, eggs are produced on the ovaries, and I'm not going to go through all of the details of egg maturation and the hormones involved. That's more for an anatomy and physiology course. But the eggs are produced on the ovaries, and a woman is born with all of the eggs that she's ever going to have. Now, once a month, starting at puberty, these eggs are triggered to migrate toward the surface. And when they migrate toward the surface, they are going to resume meiosis. So they're in these primary follicles in meiosis 1, then they go to secondary follicles and they are suspended in metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. By the time they're released from the ovary, through the process of ovulation, they're still in just metaphase 2 of meiosis 2. Now these eggs are going to start migrating up the fallopian tube, and sperm cells that were inserted into the vagina are going to swim up and unite with the eggs. The fertilization event actually happens in the first third of the fallopian tube. If it happens after that, that fertilization event will not lead to the production of a viable child. Now, as soon as the egg is released, there's this hormone that's released by the ovary that tells the uterine lining to increase in thickness. So this is going to build and build and build. And all this is doing is providing a nice little cushion for the developing embryo in order to implant in. So we've got this fertilization event that happened. Now we've got a ball of cells known as a blastocyst. And if fertilization happened in time, this blastocyst is going to embed itself right into the uterine wall. And that's when you have the implantation event. And at that point, we truly consider that this is conception. So biologists kind of refer to the implantation event as kind of the start of the pregnancy. So once this is implanted, then the cells are going to divide, and eventually we're going to have the development of the placenta. I'm going to pull up another slide here, redraw a new uterus. So we had this implantation event, and from that implantation event, the baby is developing now. So the baby, we're going to draw a little baby. Baby's happy. And we have, at about 3 months into gestation, so during the first trimester, this initial implantation event turns into a placenta. From the placenta, an umbilical cord grows into the umbilicus of the baby, and then what actually surrounds the baby is the amniotic sac. So all that is, this is placenta here, and then we have amniotic sac. Now there's a lot of things that can go wrong during pregnancy. We can have loss of the baby before this even happens. So before the placenta develops and the umbilicus attaches, if the baby is lost at any point before this placenta is produced, we consider that a miscarriage. Now, one of the biggest causes of miscarriage relates to the process of meiosis, and that is known as non-disjunction, which can happen in anaphase 1 or 2 of meiosis. So I'm going to draw non-disjunction in anaphase 2. And I'm just going to draw one cell, even though you know in anaphase 2 we have 2 cells at this point. And I'm going to blame the sperm for this scenario. Most of the time it's the egg's fault because the egg has been sitting on the ovary for the longest period of time and these chromosomes have difficulty separating. But we're going to blame the guy just because we're going to blame the guy today. So during anaphase 2, and even though this can happen in anaphase 1, I'm just going to draw anaphase 2. Remember, we have this spindle fiber that has formed, and now we don't have to draw the crossed over chromosomes. I'm just going to draw regular chromosomes. So the chromosomes are going to separate and start migrating toward opposite ends of the cell. But if we have a non-disjunction event, what's going to happen is the chromosomes are not going to separate for one of the pairs, or, let me erase that, for one of the pairs of chromosomes. So both chromosomes are going to go toward one end, and the other chromosome is not going to, the other side is going to be missing that chromosome. So if we go on to actually producing gametes from this, we've got one cell that has one copy of that chromosome and 2 copies of this chromosome. And we have another cell that has one copy of a chromosome and it's missing a copy of that chromosome. Now let's use these sperm cells in order to make a baby. So we have this sperm cell that had this one and then this one, and we're going to combine it with a normal egg. When we combine those and produce offspring, at one chromosome location, we end up with 2 copies of the chromosome that's normal that produced a diploid individual. But at the next location, so chromosome 2 location, we actually end up with 3 copies of that chromosome. When we end up with 3 copies of a chromosome, this is referred to as a trisomy. And in heredity, once we get into that, we are going to talk about what trisomies survive and so forth. But if you've ever heard of Down syndrome is trisomy at locus 21. So if you lay out all the chromosomes in pairs, so pair 1, pair 2, pair 3, pair 4, all the way down to pair 21, pair 21 has 3 chromosomes, and that's trisomy 21, and that results in Down syndrome. There's only a few trisomies that will result in viable offspring, and even fewer actually survive to adulthood. So if they survive the pregnancy, even fewer of those actually go on into adulthood. And you know the symptoms of Down syndrome and so forth, they have a decreased life expectancy. So these trisomies are detrimental and they can cause miscarriage. A majority of our miscarriages are caused to these chromosome misalignments. Now let's use the other sperm cell in order to make a baby. So we have a normal egg and this sperm cell. When we look at the offspring here, this first one has 2 copies, so that's normal. But at the second location, we only have 1 copy because we're missing the copy. So this is known as a monosomy. And the only monosomy, to our knowledge, that lives to be viable is XO Turner syndrome. So they have 1 X chromosome and they're missing a second sex chromosome. And we'll talk more about that, like I said, once we get to the heredity lecture. But monosomies and trisomies, like I said before, are a leading cause of miscarriage. Other types of miscarriages can be caused by certain types of infections, like my miscarriage was caused by an elevated body temperature due to Coxsackie virus or hand, foot, mouth disease that I got from my now 5-year-old. But you know, all sorts of things can cause miscarriages, but if it is due to a chromosomal disorder, usually it's a trisomy or monosomy that caused that miscarriage. So we went over the basics of reproduction. Now you know that the sperm and the egg meet in the fallopian tube. It implants and turns into the viable baby, and the baby can then be delivered, and then you deliver the placenta and so forth. So we talked about that. Now, how are twins formed? So there's 2 types of twins, fraternal twins and identical twins. With identical twins, you have 1 egg plus 1 sperm, and that's going to produce genetically identical twins. So how that develops is while this egg is dividing in utero and it's producing copies, all of a sudden it splits and it develops into 2 separate balls of developing cells. Now these 2 individuals will be genetically identical, and there's 4 key locations in the process of the development of this blastocyst of cells that can lead to this split where the developing ball suddenly splits in half and now you've got identical twins. Identical twins happen completely at random. There is no genetic component to inheriting this trait that magically gives you identical twins. So this is completely by chance that this would happen. Fraternal twins, on the other hand, you have 2 eggs with 2 separate sperm. So if we go back to our diagram of the uterus, you can have, and we'll do the ovary as well, you can have 1 egg released from this ovary and 1 egg released from this ovary, and then sperm can swim up and fertilize them at the same time. Or you can have 2 eggs released by 1 ovary and the sperm will come up and fertilize them at the same time. This is the more likely scenario because as soon as a sperm penetrates an egg, this egg starts releasing chemicals that kill off other sperm cells and prevent it from penetrating. So the likelihood of 2 eggs getting penetrated at the same time from the same ovary is low. It's not impossible, but this is definitely the more likely scenario. So sperm swims up, fertilizes this one, sperm swims up, fertilizes this one. These 2 individuals both implant into the uterus, and they are no more closely related than brother and sister or brother, brother, sister, sister. So they are not identical. They look like relatives, but they are not identical individuals. Now, it is possible that 2 sperm cells from 2 separate men can fertilize each one of these eggs. I'll tell you about an episode of Maury that I watched. Maybe I'll give you that one in class. But as you can see, because these sperm are swimming separately, you can have sperm from 2 separate men fertilize these 2 eggs, and you can have half siblings being delivered as fraternal twins. This is a heritable trait, so fraternal twins tend to run in families. What you're inheriting is the ability to release multiple eggs at the same time. You're inheriting the ability of your sperm to swim in a particular way to be able to penetrate multiple eggs. So there is a slight genetic component to fraternal twins. Now, if we look at other types of animal reproduction, like litter animals, for example. In litter animals, their uterus actually exists in uterine horns. So they have uterine horn and then cervix. And then they have these tiny fallopian tubes attached to the ovary, or next to the ovary. So in litter animals, they're going to release multiple eggs, and these eggs are all going to go down these horns, and there's lots of places for these to implant. Now, sperm are going to come up here and do all of these independent fertilization events, so you can have implantation of babies all along each side of the uterus. And both uterine horns can be filled up with numerous babies. With litter animals, it is possible, and way more likely, that sperm from different males are going to impregnate all of these different, or fertilize all of these different eggs. So if you think about a litter of kittens that's born, let's say it's a feral cat, it's a female cat that lives outside. When she goes into heat, multiple tomcats are going to mate her. And then sperm from those multiple tomcats can each fertilize these different eggs. So when she does have her litter, you may notice that kitten litters, especially if they're from outside cats, have a mixture of different babies. There's orange, black, brown, some have spots, stripes, some are long hair, short haired. You can have different breeds of cats coming out of the same mom from the same litter, because each one of those kittens has different dads, so they're only half siblings. They're half related to each other. So that's kind of how litter animals work. Once we get into plants, we're going to talk more about plant reproduction. Plants reproduce in a very similar way. You have male and female gametes that unite and produce offspring and so forth, but we'll save that conversation until we get to plants, particularly flowering plants later on in the semester.